Hey everyone, in today's video we're going to answer, is saturated fat bad for your heart? And the short answer is no, but we're going through an evidence-based review, going through systematic reviews and randomized clinical trials to show you why the best evidence right now points towards that saturated fat does not have negative impacts on your cardiovascular health. So where did this idea, this paradigm that saturated fat was the cause of cardiovascular disease? And it all started with Ansel Keys, who had great intentions, but as I say, the road to hell is paved with good intentions. And he conducted the 7-country study, which is a famous study. However, he failed to include many other countries that refuted his results. And it was his ego that prevented him from really looking at the data objectively instead of fudging the data to meet what he knew was correct. And further, this was, and the damage he done was further exacerbated by the sugar companies, who paid off a whole host of researchers and politicians to push fat in the doghouse so they could perpetuate the excess consumption of sugar and line their pockets. And there was an excellent article published recently in JAMA about this and how prevalent it was. It even infiltrated its way to the Harvard School of Public Health, and at one point of time almost the vast majority of their faculty were paid off by the sugar industry. So what does the best data right now state about saturated fat? So there was a landmark systematic review recently published in the British Medical Journal, and it showed that saturated fat was not associated with all-cause mortality, so that's the risk of dying from anything, cardiovascular disease, coronary artery disease, ischemic stroke, or type 2 diabetes. So let me take a quick side note on this. I think it's absolutely important. And why have I focused on systematic reviews? Now, there's a lot of other YouTubers out there. I'm not going to name any names, bash anybody, but you guys know who they are. They're haters, and they handpick random studies, most of them very basic science studies, not done in humans, and they use it to report their own views or ideas, and that is known as confirmation bias. But the power of systematic research and meta-analysis is that you're getting an expert in the field to sift through all the research, critically analyze the research, because one of the most important lessons I've learned throughout my experience in research is that not all research is created equally, and no matter how great a research study is, there's always limitations, there's always ways that could be improved, and that's why you need to repeat studies, and there's a whole host of criteria of what allows association to be more likely to be thought of as a causation. I know myself, writing my own first author systematic review, it's a rigorous, intensive process. So if you really want to understand a scenario, don't just go randomly searching in PubMed. Really look for systematic review, because that's going to give you a whole holistic view of the whole sphere of research out there. So to further build upon that systematic review I just mentioned, that was published in BMJ Open, there was a second systematic review. So this systematic review was a combination of a meta-analysis and a univariate, multivariate regression analysis of 12 studies of 7,150 patients. And the goal of this was to determine that if you reduce saturated fat intake or replaced it with polyunsaturated fatty acids. And if you're unclear about those terms, I talked about in my previous video about cooking oil, and there's so much to cover, I won't have time to go into those details, but if you feel you don't know what those terms are, go back to that video and come back here. And they wanted to look at the effect of changing the saturated fat or reducing them to polyunsaturated fatty acids on all-cause mortality and cardiovascular mortality and cardiovascular events. And they found there was absolutely no association between reducing saturated fat or replacing it with polyunsaturated fatty acids to reduce any of those main outcomes, which were all-cause mortality, cardiovascular mortality, and cardiovascular events. Further, polyunsaturated fatty acids have some unique disadvantages about them. Firstly, polyunsaturated fatty acids, which are typically your vegetable oils such as canola oil, avocado oil, grapeseed oil, etc., are super high in omega-3 fatty acids. And you may have heard in the popular press, and there's actually really good randomized clinical trials showing omega-3 fatty acids have very potent benefits and a whole host, wide-ranging of diseases. And in traditional healthy diets that we used to eat thousands of years ago, or even hundreds of years ago, the ratio of this omega-3 to omega-6 was 1 omega-3 to about 1 to 2 omega-6. Because of this influx of vegetable oils, because of this banning and this fear of saturated fat intake, this ratio is being totally skewed, and it's from 1 omega-3 to around 25 omega-6 is typical when someone is eating a traditional Western diet. And to think simplified, obviously it's much more complicated and nuanced than this, but you can think of omega-3 fatty acids as anti-inflammatory and the omega-6 fatty acids as pro-inflammatory. So you're just ramping up, the systemic inflammation in the system by consuming these high levels of omega-6. As I mentioned in my previous cooking oil video, these polyunsaturated fatty acids, these vegetable oils, are very sensitive to heat. And when you heat these up just by frying them on the stove, you create aldehydes, which have been shown to increase the risk and precipitate cancer, dementia, cardiovascular disease. So those are things you absolutely want to avoid. So move away from those polyunsaturated fatty acids because there's no benefit for your heart, and there's a whole host of detrimental effects, especially when you're consuming those vegetable oils and you're cooking them and heating them. Not only are they very pro-inflammatory with a high omega-6 content, but you're also creating these aldehydes and other molecules that just damage your system. So the last nail in the coffin on the attack of saturated fat was an article that was published in the American Journal of Clinical Nutrition. So the purpose of this study was to assess the impact of dietary macronutrients on the progression of coronary artery disease. And coronary artery disease is simply when the buildup of atherosclerosis, which is those cholesterol plaques that are building up on those coronary arteries, which are the arteries that bring blood and oxygen to the heart. And they use coronary angiogram, which is just a tool used by cardiologists to image how blocked or how patent a certain coronary artery is. And they followed 2,243 coronary segments in 235 postmenopausal women, and they assessed them at baseline and 3 years later. And it was a randomized clinical trial, and they had an intervention group and a control group. And the intervention group, they added either carbohydrates or polyunsaturated fatty acids to replace saturated fatty acids. And they found that the control group that kept saturated fatty acids had a reduced development of their coronary artery disease compared to the groups that replaced the saturated fatty acids with polyunsaturated fatty acids and carbohydrates. Why would this be? So we already talked about the polyunsaturated fatty acids and how they can lead to systemic inflammation, which is a driver of cardiovascular disease. But why would carbohydrates do this? Well, there's this huge push about LDL cholesterol and really delving into the research behind that. It's not the best markers, way beyond this, and there's been research showing that the ratio of total cholesterol to HDL is a much better predictive value of the risk of coronary vascular disease, and it's used in typical risk scores such as the Framingham risk score, etc. But this LDL cholesterol, there's a nuance to it, and there's two different particle sizes. You have the LDL-A subtype, which is very large and fluffy, and then you have the LDL-B subtype, which is very dense and compact, which relatively in that and within the LDL particle size. And it's those B-type particles that are very atherogenic. And funny enough, saturated fat tends to increase the amount of the A-type LDL particles, whereas high carbohydrate intake tends to increase the type B LDL particles, which are what create those plaques on the arteries in the body. So there are two main randomized clinical trials that have shown the positive benefit of dietary interventions in both primary prevention and secondary prevention of cardiovascular disease. And the distinction between primary and secondary is primary is just prevention attempts to prevent the disease from happening. Secondary prevention is when the disease is already present, but you want to prevent the disease from progressing. So the PREDIMED diet, the control group was counseled to eat a low-fat diet, which was, funny enough, 37% fat, versus the intervention group was a group on an unrestricted and energy Mediterranean diet supplemented with 4 teaspoons of olive oil, and this was 41% fat. And they found that there was statistically significant decreases in the incidence of cardiovascular disease, myocardial infarction, etc. And this was again found similarly in the Lion Heart study, which was again for secondary prevention. And in this you had again another Mediterranean diet and counseled on a relatively healthy diet, minimize sugars, good vegetables, but this was still much better. And they found that even though the Mediterranean significantly reduced the progression to acute myocardial infarction or heart attack, there was no changes in LDL cholesterol. So if you look at these gold standard randomized clinical trials that have been used to show the benefits of the Mediterranean diet, which is really a high fat, low carb diet, and high quality, high fat, and minimizing to the absolute minimum the processed simple sugars and having good quality carbohydrates, have drastically improved cardiovascular outcomes, but they've done so without really changing the fat content that was shown in the PREDIMED study, and without really changing LDL cholesterol, which was shown in the LION Heart study. So it seems abundantly clear that cholesterol isn't driving cardiovascular disease. So what is? And this video is inspired by an excellent article that was in the British Journal of Sports Medicine. And it was an excellent editorial by a preeminent cardiologist. And the hypothesis coming out, the cutting edge hypothesis about cardiovascular disease, it's really underlying the root cause is insulin resistance as a whole, which is a sign of metabolic dysfunction that, if it progresses, leads to type 2 diabetes. And this causes a whole kind of systemic inflammation, and it's well known in the pathogenesis of atherosclerosis that the first step is endothelial dysfunction, and one of the potential instigators of that is systemic inflammation that damages the lining of the wall or the endothelium of the blood vessels. However, and conversely, unlike dyslipidemia, insulin resistance in the literature has been shown to be much more amenable to dietary and exercise interventions. And in this British Journal of Sports Medicine article, there's an excellent quote, and it's: coronary artery disease is a chronic inflammatory disease, and it can be reduced effectively by walking 22 minutes a day and eating real food. There's no business model or market to help spread this simple yet powerful intervention. I think that's the biggest takeaway. If we look at the best cutting edge literature, it really points that it's the sugar and the carbohydrates and the polyunsaturated fatty acids, not the saturates, that are really driving this increase in cardiovascular mortality. And it's totally against what we've been told, but I think one of the most important lessons I'm learning in medicine is everybody has their own bias. I have my own bias, but you really have to search them out and try to get the most unbiased report you can. That's why I like to go to this primary literature and read it instead of what's given to us in lectures or what's released in infographics by pharmaceutical companies or by food companies, because food companies, like I mentioned before, don't make money shuttling food from a farm to the grocery. They have to convince you that a product is better. So if you get active, eat real food, and don't be scared of these high-fat diets. So removing saturated fats from the diet tends to have it replaced with simple sugars and refined carbohydrates. So to answer the question, is saturated fat good for your heart? The most cutting-edge research shows that it is. So obviously, do not take this as medical advice. This is just a detailed review of the most cutting-edge and recent literature examining saturated fat intake and cardiovascular disease. Thanks for watching.